Hey, everybody. Welcome, and I'm glad you're hanging out with us today. What we're going to talk about today is this concept, which is I am so tired of my partner telling me that I'm not emotionally available. And we're going to talk about the reason why that is today. About somebody saying, hey, you don't seem connected, you seem walled off. And I'm trying as hard as I possibly can to be connected to them. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and I'm really excited to introduce you to our guest. Welcome to Beyond the Facade podcast. I'm your host, Luke Gordon, and I'm thrilled to have you join me in this space today. What we're going to be doing is diving deep into the trials and triumphs and truths of seeking authenticity. Becoming your true self isn't about a single action or moment. It's a relentless pursuit, a commitment to self that reveals the rich connection and meaning that our life has to offer. So whether this is your first time tuning in or you're a regular listener, know this: what you're building here goes beyond a conversation. You're here to challenge, to change, and to celebrate the incredible journey of becoming your authentic self. Because when you dare to show up fully, the rewards are immeasurable. So welcome to Beyond the Facade. Let's get started. I want to introduce you to Ramneek. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I know him and who he is, and then I'm going to let him defend himself and tell you what I didn't get right. So Ramneek, thank you so much for being here. I'm so glad.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I wanted Ramneek to be here because he's a professional in this arena of the topic that we're going to have today. And when I've heard him talk about it, I really value the way he sees it. I'm not going to say he has a completely different lens coming at it through me, but I work with people that are trying to heal relationships, trying to better understand themselves, mental health, emotional well-being. And Ramneek, you have not a completely different lens, but a different take on it. And I'm excited to have you here today. What do you want people to know about you?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Luke. And yes, I think you said that well, that the mental health aspect of the folks that you interface with is important. I'm on the other end of where patients will come to me and ask for, how can I impact my ability to tolerate stress? How can I impact my relationships through my physical health being better? And so I see that side of, how can I increase your ability to be better at what you're doing with someone like Luke? And so that's essentially the way that our worlds integrate together. So I'm excited to have this dialogue with you.
Thank you, Ramneek. All right, so here's the conversation for today. I'm setting it up and I'm looking through the lens, and I'm inviting us to look through the lens of I'm in some type of relationship, and there's conflict inside that relationship. It seems like we're not managing it very well. Like my partner says to me, hey, you're walled off, you're not open, you're hiding, or they're claiming maybe that you're a level of abusive. Maybe it's verbally, emotionally. They're like, you're attacking me. And you find yourself either going, I don't even know what you're talking about, to that doesn't make sense to me, or the other side of it, which is, yeah, I'm aware of that, and I feel kind of hopeless of knowing what I'm going to do about that. I recognize some of our listeners today are going to be watching us on a video, are going to be watching video. So the stuff I screen share with you, you can see, and then some of us are going to be listening. So I'm going to attempt to verbalize this. So even if you're just listening, you know what we're looking at. And I always encourage you to go to the video on YouTube, the podcast on YouTube, to take a look at it. But let me hit his screen share button, and we're going to kick off this conversation. So if we look through that lens of navigating conflict inside of a relationship, we want to define a grounded place, and we call this grounded place our window of tolerance. So I'm going to encourage everybody here to just go, okay, learn more about what their window of tolerance looks like. So if you want to know what a window of tolerance is, here's a definition for you. It's when we think clearly and feel our feelings at the same time. So our feelings are the right size. They're not too big and they're not too small. So inside of that space, we're like, yeah, I value feelings and they feel the right size to me, and they're not too big and they're not too small. Those large emotions aren't coming. They're not hitting me right in the face, and I can connect with my partner or whoever I'm looking to. So if I'm not inside my window of tolerance, where am I? And that means I'm outside of it. We're going to talk about above or below the window of tolerance. Being above your window of tolerance is you're in hyperarousal, which is fight or flight, And just to define that, what that looks like is feelings of urgency. I'm overstimulated. I feel panicked. I have some rage. I have some thoughts that are just kind of like out of control, or ruminating thoughts, I guess I should say. And then if you're below your window of tolerance, you're like in a freeze/fawn space that we call a hypoarousal, where that's where I feel walled off, numb, like I'm shutting down. I feel disconnected from my partner. I'm disengaged. Maybe I have some shame going on. I'm wanting to just kind of be away from them, even though I'm not away from them. Any thoughts on this stuff, Ramneek?
Yeah, no, this is such a great visual because in the middle you've got an area where we are in a normal state of function. And I'm gonna approach this from a perspective of your neurology and your nervous system, because ultimately what's regulating how you are going to interface with the world around you, with a partner, in the workplace, romantically or otherwise, is going to be how you take in information and then how you process it, and how you're going to react to it biologically, physiologically. So the hyperarousal state is when you're taking in information from your brain and it's going to create a state of stress. And what's interesting about stress is that there's two different types. There's the immediate stressor, which is like the fight or flight. I always say that's the first stressor when someone says, "Hey, I'm coming over unannounced." And then that chronic stress is when they decide that they're going to camp out on your couch for 6 months, right? And so those are the
How would
differences.
stress me out?
Yeah, exactly. And so when you have that immediate stress, that acute stress, that's that epinephrine fight flight type of activation of the nervous system, where you start to feel those feelings of urgency, nervousness, anxiety, and then all the physiological factors that go with it. When you go through that experience and then you sort of exhaust those immediate hormones and neurotransmitters, then you go into a state of hypoarousal. And it's almost as though you are indeed just kind of tired and unable to interact. And then you condition yourself to respond to various types of stimuli neurologically so that you can fall into one of those states almost immediately. Classically, we go from normal to hyper, and then we exhaust out, and then we go down into hypo. But
Mhm.
there are instances where individuals over time become so chronically stressed that they can go from a window of tolerance, which can be very narrow, especially if it's chronic, and then they fall right into hypoarousal. They don't have the capacity to be anxious anymore. They don't have the capacity to fire off as well anymore in that hyper state. Very interesting that then, and there's so many variations of this where this window's big, this window's small. So in the 3 phases, you can have so many renditions of it.
What the hope is here is, as we talk about this, is I'm better able to understand when I'm inside my window of tolerance. And then a lot of people go, okay, so what do I do when I recognize what my window of tolerance looks like? And then we can go, okay, we can talk about increasing the size of your window of tolerance. But the first thing we have to know is what they are. So if you're above your window of tolerance or below it, that's survival. That means you're not in the human part of your brain. You're not in the rational part of your brain. It means you're just surviving your experience, which we know intimacy can't exist in that space. So if you're not able to see this screen because you're listening, just picture the window of tolerance being in the middle. And this has a size to it, okay? But it might be really, really narrow. So if you're the person that did the betraying, like you hurt your partner, one thing I want to create awareness around, or Ramneek and I want to create awareness around, is we don't want to just understand your window of tolerance. We want to understand that your partner has a window of tolerance. And we know if you've experienced betrayal trauma, it is very narrow, very narrow. So one of the first stages of their journey is to understand what fight, flight, or freeze looks like, because that's where they're living all the time. So if I expect expectations of my partner, like, why are you in fight, flight, or freeze all the time? And I'll give you actual examples here in a minute. It's because it's a small window of tolerance. And if I have a similar one, we have to understand that. Thoughts on that, Ramneek, before I move on here?
No, I like that because it's not just one individual, right? We often think of it as one person in this dynamic, but it can be two. And one individual's window of tolerance can be different than the others, and that can create the conflict therein. But again, I think you made a great point that you have to understand what that looks like for each of you.
So we're in a constant state of flux, y'all. So again, for those of you who can't see the screen, we want to talk about how our nervous system engages in two different ways, from our sympathetic nervous system to our parasympathetic nervous system, how that causes us to drift to hyperarousal or hypoarousal. Ramneek, do you mind talking a little bit about the sympathetic and parasympathetic, the differences, and how we have awareness of which one's engaged and what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me start off by saying that the body, when it strives to exist in a state of homeostasis, which is its normal state, right? We can alter our body's physiology and biology. And then as we alter it, it always strives to come back to a set point, whether that's your body temperature, whether that's your blood pressure, whether that's your resting mood and muscle tone. The window of tolerance is a lot like that in that it wants to come back to normal. And so it's always striving to try to rebalance things. And so the nervous system lives in a state of some balance between these two major systems, the upregulated sympathetic nervous system and the downregulated parasympathetic nervous system. And we often, from a clinical standpoint, look to see if someone's sympathetic or hyper dominant or parasympathetic or hypodominant, given what stress they may be in. If someone is being stimulated sympathetically, which is they're aroused, they're alert, everything's sort of uptick, and the brain is essentially saying, my hypothalamus is firing based on the things that I see, hear, smell, taste, or take in. That fires at the pituitary. The pituitary gland then says, hey, adrenals, kick out some epinephrine or kick out some cortisol. And that's what's going to make all these changes of your heart rate, how you breathe, what your eyes look like, whether they're dilated or constricted, whether you're flush or not, whether you're able to perceive pain. And so the sympathetic state is where you're kind of all turned onward and upward. And the parasympathetic state is just the opposite. So you think about all the things that you do in a normal window of tolerance, are not going to be able to occur. So if you're being chased by a vicious animal trying to chase you and take your life, you're not going to think about wanting to take a nap or what you're wearing, whether your clothes match, what's for lunch, digesting your food, or taking any kind of calm thought. On the other hand, if you're in a hypoarousal, you can't do the other. You can't actually get away from what it is you're trying to get away from it. So it's such a huge dichotomy of being in one or the other, but both come with their inherent risks.
I love that. So what we try to do here is when I'm working with clients in a group setting or a one-on-one setting, and I'll go with the people I'm typically around, which is men. And these men weren't taught in their family of origin, in their youth, in their childhood, to value emotion. There were only certain emotions that were recognized as valuable. So they're very disconnected and disassociated from their body, and they can't recognize it. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to say, okay, you're in constant flux. Your body's going to try to get to a place of, like you said, homeostasis. But we want to create awareness around when I'm going to start to drift into a different state, which means I don't have the ability to engage in intimacy anymore. I don't have the ability to engage. So that means I can become aware, and then I can respond differently and create different patterns so I can stay inside my window of tolerance. We talked about this already, but I want to go more in depth, which is, what do each one of these states look like? So what we did is we got a group of men together and we took a collective whole of, what do you experience? So I'm curious, as you're listening to this, how many of these apply to you? Window of tolerance, and we won't spend much time on this. Window of tolerance, these men said, if I'm there, my breath is steady. I experience empathy for my partner. I'm experiencing compassion for myself or my partner. I see their experience. I feel more clear-minded. I'm present instead of predicting what's going to happen next in the conversation. I'm not jumping ahead and I'm trying to control the outcome. I'm aware of those feelings and valuing them. That's what window of tolerance looks like for these men. Any comments on that? I know we kind of already talked about it, Ramneek. Anything
Yeah,
on that?
no. I think I would add, like, the feeling of safety and security probably go in really well with that homeostatic window of tolerance. When you feel safe and secure, all those other things are in place. And I know that from a relationship building perspective, those two things are critical.
I love that you said that. And you think about your partner that you've hurt. In order to be in window of tolerance, I have to feel safe and secure. So think about that. You're the person that hurt them, which means, can they be around you and probably feel safe and secure? Probably not, which means they're not going to be in the window of tolerance. So if I expect them to behave in a window of tolerance way, It's not a fair expectation for them to be that way and for me to expect them to show up that way. So thanks for pulling that in there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so the hyperarousal, again, knowing we already talked about it, this is what other people said. If I'm with my partner and I'm experiencing fight or flight, that's my mind's racing. I'm easily offended. Whatever they're saying at me, I take offense to that or some version of that. This one's interesting, urgency to take action. So I've got to say something. And this is like fixing it. I got to fix it. I've got to make this better. We got to get out of this space of whatever she's saying. Very defensive. That's what they feel. They feel like their partner's the enemy. They're like, this isn't my partner. This is somebody that's trying to hurt me. They don't view him in that ally. They view him in that person that's going to hurt them space. One guy said, blood rushes to my head and I feel pressure behind my eyes. He actually was able to identify the physiological experience. And I was like, you did so much work, like really great work recognizing what that would look like. He would, deflecting. Some of actually create conflict, and they view conflict like, no, we got it. In order to fix this, fight is the right thing to be doing. It makes the most sense to me.
From a patient experience, from my perspective, when patients come in and they are in that hyper state and they've never experienced it before, they'll often tell me that I'm not an aggressive person. I've never showed anger. I've never lost my cool, especially not with my spouse, not with my kids, not with my boss, my coworkers. And that when I'm in this hyper state and my stress physiology is then triggered this mood change. And I've gone to all these other doctors who said, here's some things that you could do. Here's some meds that you can take, but it's not fixing the issue. I still feel like I'm upset, I'm upregulated, or I'm angry at people, and I'm not an angry person. I'm just not myself. And I hear that a lot in the hyper-aroused state.
That's cool, because often what we have is we have a betrayed partner who comes and says, my partner, they're in fight mode. And the partner sometimes says, I'm not raising my voice. And it's interesting because you're saying these people are aware of it. And I love that because there's levels of awareness that come through this experience.
Right.
That's cool. So if you have hypo with a freezer fawn, what people said is, this one's impactful to me because this was my experience, like my go-to, not my go-to, that's the wrong way to put it, was hypo. It was freeze, and specifically fawn. So these men said, when I'm engaged with my partner in conflict, frozen, I'm like shutting down. I can't control my body. I can't even get myself to speak, to use words. I avoid this. I'm not necessarily sometimes leaving, but sometimes just not talking. They have thoughts of nobody understands me. Like they're not going to get me. This conversation's pointless. It's not worth it to even have this. It's not going to help. Hopelessness, shutting down, those various things, self-pity. So with hypoarousal, there's this experience where a lot of this was born out of family of origin. Well, first of all, it's a human experience. It's biological. It's built into us. But the method in which we use to survive when it comes around hypo, I found to be very fascinating. Let's say you have parents that you view as scary. Maybe they yell at you. Maybe they demean you. Or they put you down. And they don't have to agree to this. It's just what you feel. That part of you fighting back and defending yourself or getting away from them, it doesn't work because you're a little person. So fight or flight, you can't punch hard enough and you can't run fast enough to get away from them because you're little. So you go to freeze, which is I shut down, but the other part of freeze is fawn, which means, okay, I can't shut down forever because if I shut down forever, I'll die, which means if I don't start going along to get along, if I don't just comply with what my parents say, if I don't just do what they say, then my needs won't get met and it won't be good for me. So that's where fawning comes into play, which is we notice some of the betrayed partners or the person that did the betraying, they go along with their spouse because they don't feel like they have a choice. And that's a survival experience. And it's important to recognize that.
Yeah. Let me comment on this one because this one's a really tough one for me clinically. When patients have come to me clinically and have said, look, I'm having some issues with fatigue, I'm having some issues getting out of bed in the morning. I'm dealing with a degree of depression and a degree of inability to engage and get excited about my day, get out of bed and get active. That has led to chronic fatigue throughout my day. That's also led to things like my metabolism changing and poor choices in what I eat and don't eat, drink and don't drink. And then they're also talking to me about how this has impacted their relationships long term, how I'm not able to engage at a level, I'm not able to have fun. And it's not just a romantic partner, it can be my children, my brothers and my sisters and family events and these sorts of things. And this particular component of hypoarousal, when it gets chronic, becomes very troublesome because it's a longer road to recovery from a perspective of what we have to do physiologically to help a patient come out of it. Now, there are two parts to this. One is that there's an acute portion where, like you said, freeze or fawn in the moment, which you can recover from relatively quickly. But then as it goes on and on and on, we're talking probably weeks to months, we can start to see this part be more chronic in certain patients. And that's where we start to get into long-term concerns of like depression and long-term mental well-being and interactiveness with people in the workplace and overall productivity.
So I got a question for you then. I don't know if I've thought about that this way before, so maybe we just work through this one together.
Yeah.
I don't prefer to work with one type of client than the other. It's easy for me to relate to somebody that has freeze fawn as a go-to survival mechanism because I can relate to it really well. But it's almost, it's not this black and white. So I just want to put that asterisk out there. Just want to say that. Say I'm oversimplifying it, I know. I'd almost feel like it's a quicker turnaround time for a fight or flight once he has awareness over his than it is for somebody that's in freeze, specifically fawn, for them to not use that survival behavior to fawn, to just do whatever their partner says. They really feel like the only way I can survive this life is to do what other people want me to do. Compared to the fight or flight, people are more willing to stick around, but specifically let go of their spears, their arrows, their bullets, compared to I can't get rid of this, just I'm going to go along and get along. Does that have anything to do with this?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's more motivation in a patient or an individual who's dealing with hyper stress as opposed to depletion of certain neurotransmitters or brain chemistry and hormones to be able to come down from a hyper state and naturally fall back into a window of tolerance as opposed to, I would say, build themselves back up. So falling down into it as opposed to building back up, because building back up requires reconstructive work. It requires the replenishing of neurotransmitters. Certain hormones have to then be re-regulated, and then people can get back into that homeostatic state. There is a physiological truth to that and corollary to that if someone is in one of those states. Absolutely.
Thank you for saying that. I want to spend more time thinking about that because that's cool. Let's go to awareness. And by the way, so if you're do a lot of fawning and freezing compared to that, it's just, there's a book called No More Mr. Nice Guy, which is around that I really love, which is I'm trying to project to everybody what they want to see. So if that's it, I'm not inviting you to leave here feeling, oh my goodness, my journey is way harder than other people's. It's just recognizing where you're at. So the next part is everybody says, okay, all right, I'd like to understand what the tools are. Give me the tools. These tools might be, I don't know, maybe a little disappointing, might be invigorating. I don't know. I guess not sure what your experience will be. But if we want to stay in our window of tolerance, it's about recognizing when we're drifting and leaving. And then if I'm drifting and leaving, what can I do to stay there? I'm going to briefly touch on these because there's a lot of content out there on this, which is in men, typically like traditional, like men full of bravado, ego, like our regular American men, or I shouldn't say American, we have listeners from all over the place with ego. I don't want to do any of this stuff. This stuff seems stupid. What's the point? So here's the kind of stuff: mindfulness, recognizing I feel myself drifting. Like I'm wanting to fight back. I'm wanting to whatever, the things we previously talked about. Breathing, letting your body know you're safe. You're okay. physical activity that regulate arousal, vigorous activity that releases some of the emotions or at least brings you in touch with those. Soothing your senses, like stopping and noticing. These are like meditation experiences. Noticing what you're experiencing. What am I hearing? What can I touch? What can I smell? What can I taste? Bringing a connection back to the sense that we have. Challenging our thoughts, countering those negative thought processes with new ones, recognizing what they are. And then one of my favorite ones is writing things down, the journaling piece, the drawing your attention back to what my rational mindset is, because I'm able to vomit on a piece of paper what's not rational. So those are just some pieces of staying inside of your window of tolerance, recognizing. Any thoughts on that, Ramneek?
Yeah, absolutely. Window of tolerance. I love how your infographic here, and those who can't actually see it, the window of tolerance in this particular slide has now increased, and it's now full of all these practices that you can engage in to help increase it and open it up to get even bigger. Let me comment on a couple of things. First is physical activity. What I find with patients physiologically when we talk about physical activity, well, let me backtrack just a second. When you engage in a amount of physical activity, somewhere around 30 minutes, now give or take maybe 10 minutes on either side of that based on your level of physical fitness. When you engage in about 30 minutes of activity, you actually blow off stress hormones. So cortisol levels actually come down, you regulate a little bit. Now, when you think about it, when you get into about 30 minutes of activity, you've blown off steam, so to speak, and your hormones are starting to kind of come down, you feel better. Let's say you keep going. Let's say you're doing some sort of exercise. You just keep going past 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 50 minutes, 60 minutes. Suddenly the body says, hold on, you're making more demands of me. And so I need to fire back. I need to throw another log on the fire. I need to fire up that cortisol back up again. I need to fire those hormones back up again. So physical activity is very interesting in that, yes, if we generally say about 30-minute increments of activity can help increase your window of tolerance. Give or take what your physical fitness is, if you go beyond that, you can actually start to have a counterproductive effect with it.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now let's take it in the hypoarousal state. If someone's actually in an exhausted, tired, freeze type of state, they don't even have the motivation to want to exercise often or get physical. And so they say, shall I go to the gym and lift weights and do all these like really vigorous activities? I always say, no, time out, hold on. What's best for you is to do activities that are more mindful, more centering, maybe some yoga, maybe some Pilates, maybe a mindful walk in nature, maybe just some gentle stretching, sitting in one spot. So based on whether or not the patient presents to me in a sympathetic dominant hyperarousal or parasympathetic dominant hypoarousal state, based on my assessment, I make my recommendations for exercise accordingly.
That's cool. That's cool.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
That's good. They have, and it makes so much sense. If you run forever, at some point, you're going to go like, I got to survive because I'm about to kill myself, right? So you're going
Right.
to survive.
You think some of these athletes who like push their bodies too hard and certain biological mechanisms fail to actually take a normal course because they push their body so hard, right?
Well, and what I think about my own run in the morning, I don't know at what point, because when I wake up and I go for a run, what part may be survival, what's not. What I really enjoy about getting in my window of tolerance after my run is my ability to be able to meditate after a run and be able to go and connect with my emotions and my thoughts. And I know some of that happens during my run, but I love the outcome and I love what you're talking about there. It's so good.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we're going to start to conclude this last piece, which is you were talking about here, Ramneek, the size of the window.
Yeah.
My favorite part, which is this is how I stay in my window of tolerance, but we want to talk about how we increase our window of tolerance. It's funny. I'd like to ask all you listeners to think for yourself. I wish you could hit pause, but what do you think you do to increase your window of tolerance? That's the question I have for you. If this helps me stay in my window of tolerance, how do you increase it? If you want to hit pause, go ahead. But so I expected you did, because I would like to know what you think it would be. But here's what we do to increase our window of tolerance or expand it is we visit little t or big T trauma when you're inside your window of tolerance. So what that means is I have to go back and visit the pieces of my life and my journey that has me recognize this is bad, you're not safe. And you go back to those traumatic experiences while you're inside of your window of tolerance and process through those and think about those and give different meanings to those. So the question I have on the slide for those of you who aren't seeing this, which is the question I have for you, which is where and when are you doing that? So what place do you have inside of your life for places that you visit your little T, big T trauma, and you go back there? I've said this before. This podcast isn't to pitch Choose Recovery Services or myself or anything else. It's to promote health. And it doesn't need to be choose, but what actions are you taking to visit that little T, big T trauma? So we're not going to talk, I'm going to do this in another podcast. What is little T trauma? What is big T trauma? But just give you a little bit of a nugget. Big T trauma is stuff in your past that is, it's abuse. And it's funny, now I'm finding myself wishing I had my list in front of me. It's heavy things that are traumatic based experiences. Maybe you've been in the military. Maybe you've gone through a divorce. Maybe you've been seriously ill or somebody that did those types of things. And then little T traumas, those things are very significant because they altered the way that you saw your world. And now you respond differently to your world because of it. So we'll spend some time going through what that little T, big T trauma is, because it's not going to get bigger unless I tackle that stuff. Thoughts on that, Ramneek?
Yeah, I would say that when I'm working with the folks that I do work with, I help create a physiological foundation for them to be in their window of tolerance longer. And then they find that when they go to see someone like Luke or whoever their mental health care provider is, that they're able to then visit little T, big T without that low level of triggering or high level of trigger, however you think of it, based on whatever that little T or big T trauma is. And they come back and they say, hey, since we've been doing this work, since you've been helping me stay in this window of tolerance, I'm able to have that conversation longer. I'm able to actually go back and revisit and relive what it is I experienced as a child or what I experienced with my relationships that have gotten me into this narrow window of tolerance. And one of the things that it helps is this lifestyle in general. It doesn't just have to be mindfulness things. It can be the things we eat and don't eat and drink or don't drink as well. Those are all critical things that help contribute to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that so much. And thank you for the work that you do to allow people to get to a space where they're inside of their window of tolerance enough that they can tackle their trauma. And if you go, oh, I got to say one big thing. I want to tell those people right now that have experienced betrayal trauma, when I'd say, hey, your spouse needs to tackle their trauma, that's a messy thing for me to say because I'm not comparing their little T trauma to your big T trauma. So I wish I would have started off with that this isn't a comparison. And if your partner tries to weaponize and say, hey, I listened to a podcast and I got trauma too, so maybe we need to make some space for that. That's not your responsibility if you've been traumatized by your spouse through betrayal, okay? Yeah, they need to understand the root cause, but that's not your responsibility to hold space for them. And then if you are the person that is betraying and you have that, sort that out. We'll do a podcast on what those things are, but your partners are responsible to hold that. Ramneek, any closing thoughts before we start to wrap this thing out?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to say that the majority of my patients that come to me seeking help with stress physiology are women. And the ones that tend to see a faster and more productive progression and success are those who have their partners who show up with them and are sitting there and understanding what's going on with this window of tolerance as I use my infographics and I say, hey, this is how this is impacting this hormone, mood, metabolism, your thyroid, all these sorts of things. And when the partner's there, oftentimes a husband, and it is, oh, wow, I can see this. I understand what you're going through physiologically. It's not just you're being moody towards me. And so that joint effort is beneficial in that clinical setting as well as it is for you when you see them working together.
Thank you. Thank you. So if you find yourself really struggling to be attentive to your partners, if you're the person who betrayed your partner or hurt your partner and you find yourself really struggling with survival type mechanisms, getting defensive, shutting down. We just want to create awareness of when you're leaving your window of tolerance, how big it is. So please get yourself into an environment where you can ask more questions to learn about what you're experiencing. Please don't tackle that on your own and own that. Again, Ramneek, thank you so much for hanging out with us today. Appreciate you a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, thanks for joining us today. If this is something that you connected with, I'd love to meet with you more and talk about it. So what you can do is go to chooserecoveryservices.com or check the show notes. And there what we can do is set up a quick conversation to meet. Thanks so much for listening to Beyond the Facade, where we unmask the authentic self.